Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here on this platform talking about some of the very pertinent issues that corporates are dealing with today. Primarily inclusion, culture, innovation, and how to really drive and motivate their employees. Rishad, Amit, thanks so much for being with us here today. And I'm going to start off with you, Rishad, because you've actually inculcated the 5 habits that corporates or Wipro should in fact, lead with when it comes to dealing with your hundreds of thousands of employees. Talk us through that and how you're trying to build a more inclusive culture, not just in terms of gender, ethnicity, but also in terms of ideas and collaboration.
Yeah. Does this work? Okay, that's good. No, so 2 things. One is, about inclusiveness is a mindset, right? So to be inclusive, you first have to have diversity in organizations. And we've been very purposeful about building diversity, frankly, in the last few years. And, I'll share a story that was very interesting. I was having this conversation with one of my board members. And I was telling him, look, when I'm looking to hire people, I'm oftentimes looking to find commonality. Do I like this person? Can I have a drink with in the evening with this person? Can I have a cup of coffee with this person? And he said to me, that's the completely wrong way to look for people. You should look for people who are very different than you, who challenge you, who make you uncomfortable, who can be reporting to and just you're trembling to deal with them, right? Because they bring different perspectives to the table, and diversity does that for you. You get diversity of ideas on the table when you have diversity of ethnicity and gender and experiences and where you've lived and the kinds of jobs you've done and the communities you belong to. And so, to me, that's incredibly powerful in terms of how do you bring a very strong mindset to the table. To make that inclusive, you have to think about biases. All of us have biases, some of them are conscious. And as leaders and as people and as individuals, how do we work on being aware of the biases that we have, and so how can we control them? But equally importantly, on the unconscious bias. So one of the things we are spending a lot of time on training is how do we get people trained on unconscious biases so we can make the environment much, much more inclusive. And so we've been on this journey of making the organization more inclusive, but it's a journey and it's a lot of work, but I think we are richer for that in terms of what we bring to the table as a group. The other thing you asked me about is the habits, which I feel very passionately about, because about 4 years ago when I took over this role, one of the things I realized, which was quite simple but for me very profound, was we've been articulating our values as a company for the last 50 years. But I realized people don't experience your values. They experience your behaviors, and as a consequence of which they interpret whether you live your values or not. So for example, you can say we're very respectful as a company, which most companies say, but if you are rude and abrasive and don't listen to people and don't include them in conversations, you're not demonstrating respect even though you say you're respectful. And so we've been on this journey of how do we get people to show up, to live these values in action through behaviors, which is what you and I experience every day. And so I've personally spent maybe 300 hours, made about 105 sessions, made about 35,000 of our colleagues, just talking through stories about why this is important in the way you show up, because I think it's terribly important in organizations overall, but even more so in services, people-oriented organizations.
And I think that's a big sign, the fact that you've talked about how much time you personally invest in this, because culture is no longer a nice to have, it's actually a must have in an organization. It's equivalent almost to performance. Amit, let me get your perspective, because you've dealt with organizations in the private area, but also in the social area. So you've seen it across spectrums. What are you seeing on ground, and how do you see companies try to incorporate a more inclusive culture?
Yeah. So Aabha, it's actually quite interesting. I've had the privilege of trying to build 2 organizations in the financial services space, one bank and one private equity firm, and serving on the boards of some of India's largest organizations. And then in the last 10 years, I've been involved in trying to build a large social sector organization as well. I can tell you that the interesting thing that has struck me is that trying to serve the social sector is far, far more challenging than trying to serve the purpose of trying to build profit. I know all of the folks in this room are from that space, but since I straddle both worlds, I can take the liberty of saying that. And what struck me is that if you purely leave it to merit, women actually outshine men. It's my work in the social sector, is actually quite challenging. We do a lot of work in rural development. It peaks typically in summer, 45 degrees, 50 degrees centigrade. All the work is in aspirational districts. You work with frontline workers, with district collectors, government agencies, and 80% of my team is basically women. They've been trying to solve the issue of diversity by hiring more men, but when it comes down to really just getting the job done, it's women who basically got the job done for us. So the issue for me really, when I've stepped back and I've had this privilege of straddling both sectors and thinking about why do we really have this inclusion problem, and we were talking about this earlier before this talk, it's really addressing the issue of supply at the beginning and then making sure that once we address that issue, we don't have the drop-offs. And I think if we need to address both those issues in parallel. I think Rishad made very valid points on walking the talk and doing basic things right. But first and foremost, I think we need to really address the issue of supply. Because for a long time, I think in the corporate sector at least, we've just not had adequate supply. I think that will change. You had Ashish, here before this, and Ashish and I have been trying to build one of India's eminent liberal arts institution, which will have actually very different thinking from the IITs and the technological institutes. And I can tell you again, when you build a merit-based organization, 50% or 57% of our recruits are women. So I think supply will, at some point of time, get addressed. Rishad gave me a great statistic that now, more than half their intake is women. I think that's wonderful. But we need to figure out how to address that with more urgency and then make sure the drop-offs at the standard points where the drop-offs happen get reduced.
So how did the post-pandemic and continuing hybrid culture play a role in either adding further to this workforce, or has it been a challenge in getting people to come back to the offices? Because, of course, we've been talking about this a lot in the tech space, and it's a continuous debate.
Yeah. I'm going to say something controversial, which I think...
I'm glad.
Rishad, you leave the controversial part to me.
No, but look, I think, look, the tech industry is one of the most spoiled industries in terms of sort of this model of how we're working. We're the only industry that's working so uniquely, right? And we were passionately discussing how it's so incredibly important to come back together. And I love what Amit said, and I'm going to steal it. He said, the difference is between having a friend and a Facebook friend, right? And when you're connecting with people continuously, virtually, you're not building the kind of connects. And I'll give you a very simple example from yesterday. I had a customer in town in Bangalore, and I spent an hour and a half over lunch with him. And I had met him in June 2020 for the first time ever, and we met virtually, right? And I have such little memory of him in terms of the persona or that conversation. And I won't forget the conversation from yesterday, right? And that is the difference between the physical and the virtual connect, right? A couple of design principles which I deeply believe in. The future of work is hybrid, right? Which means people should have flexibility to work from home, but people should also be coming in to organizations. The reality is you have to access talent. So we've got to try and go to where talent is, as opposed to continuously bringing talent to the big cities, right? So we have to expand in terms of how we access to also make it more inclusive, right? And we've got to appreciate that relationship matters, right? I feel that one of the reasons the virtual model also worked back 3 years ago is because a lot of people knew each other. But if I just look at the IT services industries, which has added an enormous number of people and have seen high attrition over the last 3 years, 40, 50, 60% of people in the organizations, in terms of physical people, are new to the organization. They've never walked into an office. They've never built a relationship physically with someone in many instances. And you can't build that kind of connectedness and intimacy, I feel, no matter how advanced technology gets. We're human beings, and that doesn't change if you're the chairman of a company or a fresher joining from campus. We all emote, and we all need a sense of connectedness. So I'm a big believer we should be coming back in some shape and form and connecting, because there's an intimacy to it that is irreplaceable with technology.
Absolutely. And building on that, Amit, and I can already see you've got something to add, but how do you also build a culture of trust? Because you need that one-on-one interaction. You also need to trust the people that you're meeting for the first time, trust that they're bringing multiple opinions. Everybody wants to be a stakeholder today.
Yeah. No, look, I'm a big believer in everything Rishad just said. if you can't look people in the eye, which is a little tough to do in Zoom, I'm sure someone will figure out AI algorithm for that, but it's just really difficult to build trust. And I do think that we got to figure out how technology can be an enabler and provide people the necessary flexibility. And so we got to figure out what the right balance is in terms of work from home and the flexibility, and yet ensure that people come back to work. And I do think that the technology industry doesn't really fully get how much the rest of the world has come back to normal. I mean, we own companies across sectors. We currently own 3 tech companies, and a large part of our portfolio is non-tech. And I think you don't quite fully appreciate how much rest of the world has, gone back to normal versus the tech world is living in its own kind of, and I think all of that in my mind is going to cause a lot of problems, not just for the tech sector, but also for individuals. I think it's going to cause mental health issues, which I think we're not quite appreciating. It's going to cause cultural issues, which will then manifest into, problems of performance. I don't know whether companies are adequately measuring productivity, whether all of the work from home is actually contributing to productivity or not. And so all of this in my mind is, and I know the moonlighting issue is a hot potato for a lot of organizations, but I think this, while there was great merit for it during the short period of time during the pandemic, I think we need to find the right balance of how to use technology, and I think we are very far from finding the right balance.
So in terms of accountability, since you just touched upon it, Rishad, let me get your view in terms of how do you measure this? How do you measure productivity? How do you measure the contribution when you're looking at culture, values, diversity, and what that brings to an organization? How are some of these intangibles turning into tangible metrics?
Yeah. So to me, there are 2 different things, right? One is measuring how people are performing while working from home, and 2 is just measuring when you're driving cultural changes as well. I'm a bit of a skeptic on the cultural piece. One of the things we've struggled with as we've been on this cultural transformation journey is a big push in how do you measure it. And my biggest worry, frankly, was we don't want to end up in a place where 95% of people feel the metric is met and yet nothing has changed, right? And that can oftentimes happen because you can meet the metric on paper, but defeat the spirit of the metric, right? And so I think that's incredibly important that you find the right balance. And I think with culture, it's a journey, not a destination. You don't arrive that you have transformed, right? All organizations have cultures, whether it's purposeful or not. You walk into a company, they smell, and they smell of something good or bad, but cultures are formed implicitly, not explicitly. I think also on the measure of productivity, as people have been working from home, we've wrestled with this, right? And one of the things we are trying to move more and more as an organization is to an element of trust, right? How do you trust people that they are working from home? How do you trust that they're delivering what they have to deliver? Certainly it's showing up in projects. If they're not delivering their projects, then it's showing up very quickly. But we're trying to move to a trust mindset versus a control mindset, even in our processes, which lots of technology services companies have built over the years because they've scaled. How do you manage the exception rather than make 95% of the people who follow the rule go through the pain of bureaucracy and cumbersome processes? So the whole element of accountability is moving in our mind more and more to trust as opposed to control. And I think dealing with the exceptions more stringently, we believe, is a better way of taking that forward.
So there was a phase where I think the power dynamic shifted more towards the employees, and now it's shifting a little bit back towards the employers. Now, a lot of this conversation is on the basis of the fact that diversity, culture adds to innovation, adds to productivity, adds to loyalty, and there are statistics to show that. Do you see a culture of innovation emerging as well in your organizations when you're implementing and taking so much time to build trust with employees, to give them access to resources, to allow them to be stakeholders in projects and so forth? Do you actually see the quality of innovation also improving?
Yeah. So, Aabha, you made 2 important points, I think. The first one is about the pendulum swinging. I think organizations which are value-based, and I think Rishad talked about this at the beginning, always walk the talk and will not make will not exploit any one point in that pendulum cycle. So just because, the pendulum is swung one particular way, they will not, go out and basically exploit employees. And just because it's swinging the other way, that's fine. Employees will make the most of them, but they may not basically react to it. So I think it's important in general to maintain that sense of balance. I think that's one point. The second point is actually really important. I mean, this has been one of my experiences in innovation. I chair the Marico Innovation Foundation as well, and look very carefully at organizations which are being innovative. Our foundation is, our own foundation actually does a lot of innovative work in rural development and capacity building. And my experience in both those journeys has been that you got to do a few things right. The one thing that is really, really basic is keeping two-way communication open, all the way from the frontline worker that you have to the top, but also to partners that you work with. Because the best ideas that you get could be literally from anywhere. I mean, we do a lot of work in water security in 5 states. And one of the simplest ideas that we got, which is now scaling up across all the 5 states, we actually got it from a partner in Karnataka in one meeting that we had in a village development meeting 3 or 4 years ago. And we got that aha, and then we quickly kind of took it all the way, across everywhere. There was one lady who, joined our team a few years ago, who actually was interacting with one of our partners in Rajasthan, who actually got us to understand what the pain of one partner was, and that got us thinking about how we solve the problem of many partners. And she was able to bring that right to the leadership. And so I think innovative organizations will be those who will figure out how to make ideas really flow, irrespective of where they come from. And irrespective of how many layers you have. All large organizations will always have layers. That's a fact. You can't create a layerless organization. But the ability to make these ideas flow, and then your ability to act upon the best ideas will, I think, drive innovation going forward.
And just one more point on that. I fully agree with what Amit said, Aabha. I think also the environment you create, I found 2 things that work. One is, how do you encourage an environment of risk-taking, right? And 2 is, how do you celebrate failures, right? Celebrating things that don't work and tom-tomming it is as important as celebrating things that work. Because otherwise, I think you kill the spirit of trying new things continuously. And innovation by design doesn't mean means that everything will not succeed. And I have found that teams that do that well, it doesn't have to be always at an organization level, but even the teams that do that well, I find spark a lot more stuff than teams that don't do that well. People who pat their teams on the back and say, go out and try this, no matter what, I got your back, as opposed to go out and try this, and if you fail, you're dead, have a very different reaction in terms of what they're able to accomplish.
So,
good point.
It is IWD month, and, in light of that, I don't mind asking both of you, when do you see things moving towards equalization or normalization, where some of these conversations around inclusion, whether it's across gender, ethnicity, etc., are diminished somewhat because it's become the norm?
Yeah, when I was talking to you, you cited some statistics earlier that if you look at the projections that organizations like the UN are making, they're saying that this may take 25, 30 years more. My own view is that societies typically reach tipping points when changes get accelerated, right? No one assumed, for example, the things happening with electrification today with automobiles would happen, renewable energy, etc. I have a feeling that, things will happen much quicker. We need to reach that tipping point, and I'm hopeful that we'll hit that tipping point somewhere in the next 10 years. The statistics that Rishad was giving me before this session on what organizations like them are doing on recruiting, for example, are very encouraging. And I think we need to there's more work to be done in, corporate India, especially to basically, make sure that women are supported adequately. Like, for example, I feel that every major business center must have creches. You know, this is something basic that happened in the US in the 80s, 90s, that every major business building had a creche, right? So there are some basic fundamental building blocks we need to think about, other than just cultural changes. But when these enablers happen, I think the drop-offs will get reduced as well. I think that somewhere in the next 10 years, we'll hit the tipping point. And maybe in the decade after that, magic will happen.
You know, a couple of things. One is the tech industry is quite fortunate. You know, 50% of what the industry hires today is women. 36% of people employed in the industry are women, and 10% of leadership is women. Right. So if you want to move women into leadership, you've got to build the supply chain, and you've got to ensure that that 50% is not dropping down to 36% and then 10%. You know, Amit was sharing this interesting statistic that he heard from someone else in the green room, that which are the tipping points when women especially tend to leave the workforce. More and more, they don't tend to leave the workforce when they get married. They tend to leave their workforce for the first time when they have children. They then perhaps come back to work. They then leave the workforce typically when their children go into 9th or 10th grade because they're going into board exams and those kinds of things. And then they didn't leave the workforce when they have to look after aged parents or aged in-laws. And if we as industries, and certainly we as a tech industry, can find ways to offset those challenges, it can be very powerful. So a very simple example, you know, when we are strongly, and I know many people in the industry are strongly encouraging women to come back after they have children. One of the things we've said is, if somebody left a program before maternity, they're going to go back into the exact same program when they come back. So they almost have their seat saved for them when they come back. So it becomes an easy start. That's just one simple example. But how do we form avenues and ways to make it much easier, A, for people not to leave at all, or certainly to come back, so we can then reach this equilibrium, I think, much faster?
You're both global leaders. You know, I wanted to just touch upon where we are at in terms of innovations and cultural evolution when we look at the global picture and some of the corporates driving this globally. Do you feel that we're at par? Do you feel we have a lot of catching up? You would have a better perspective.
So on innovation, I think we are still maybe 2 on 10. Ashish made some good points on the session just before this. But a lot of work is actually happening to change that. You know, particularly, I think we need to invest very heavily on the sciences side. Institution building is probably the big area we need to make a big investment. A number of us are investing in building institutions that I think will hopefully change that. By the way, that will create a lot of opportunity for women because, you know, unfortunately, on the engineering side, you know, we know the statistics, but on the sciences side, actually, there's a big opportunity for women, and I think that will create opportunities on the innovation side as well. So I'm actually hopeful that in the next 10 years, we will start seeing some change happen on the innovation side. But for that, we need institution building. We need to unlock a lot more capital. That capital, I think, some of it will come from the government. We forget that even now, most of the research in the country is actually government funded. Very little private funding, be it from corporate India or from philanthropy, actually goes for research. So, research or innovation. So we need to change that culture as well. I think if we can change those two things in the next 10 years, I think the innovation ecosystem in this country can dramatically change, and that can really help accelerate the whole development of this country. But I do think that that's one thing we should think very hard about.
And one thing that surprises you about, you know, there's been this dynamic shift in leadership, let's say pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, or in the last 10 years. One thing that surprises you when you're bringing on board a whole new generation of employees, surprises or challenges you. I know you've been caught up in the moonlighting debate, but that or otherwise, you know, something that's led you to lead towards change.
I think the one thing I think has been changing for years, and I think COVID has certainly accelerated it, is I think the days of the authoritarian leader are more and more diminishing. That's my personal view. I'm hopeful that's the case. I think the space for, you know, authentic, empathetic, vulnerable leadership, you know, where I need help, I don't know, is very much becoming pervasive. And I found that leaders who were able to empathize and connect with people during COVID was very powerful. You know, one of the best stories I heard was from a customer, and he said to me, you know, I call my people, my direct reports, 15 of them, for 5 minutes every 3 weeks. So I spend about 75 minutes, and I call and I say, I have no agenda. I'm just going to see if you're okay. This is the heart of COVID. If your family is okay, if I can be helpful, if the company can be helpful. And he said, just simply sharing that built more equity and connect for me with my teams than all the other meetings and conversations I had had with them over the many, many years. So just a simple caring and connect, I think, is incredibly important as leadership. And I'm a big believer in the inclusive, empathetic, vulnerable style of leading.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think my own sense is leaders need to probably be a lot more agile, just given everything which is happening in the world. And because of that need for agility, they actually need to spend a lot more time internally than externally, oddly enough. You cannot simply, address everything going on in the world by responding to all of that without actually being a lot more on top of your teams. You got to be a Zubin Mehta, who's orchestrating this incredible, orchestra. Everyone's performing to full potential. They are playing together as opposed to playing, even if they are great performers, independent of each other. So I think while the general, bias of each leader is to respond to the outside, which is the external metric, right? Let me go and get the sales function humming. Let me get whatever is the external metric the companies measure to, let me go and do that. But I think given the need for building sustainable organizations, agile organizations, I think you need to spend a lot more time getting the internal organization humming. And I think that's going to be a lot more important, in my view, going forward.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for setting the agenda for leaders to take forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much.